this case, since there's just a few of us, I'm going to go ahead and do that. And then after the presentation, I'll definitely give time for questions. So the other way you can ask us is if you want to open up the chat, which you can find under the 3 dots on your screen in your upper right corner, I believe. You can go ahead and type them in chat, and either Janelle or Christina will field them to me when we're done with the presentation. Does anybody have questions before we get going? Okay,
No.
then we'll, yes. Oh, sorry, I thought TJ had a question. I think you just said no, though. So
Yeah, I said no.
okay, all right then. So this is what we like to call our PIM. It's a public information meeting. We do them every Friday at 5 p.m. Typically, I announce it along with the topic on Wednesday mornings on our Oregon Wild Horse Organization Facebook page, and they also get posted on our Twitter. So you can find that information either place. If you want to be invited to these every week, make sure you let me know that you want to be on the weekly invite list. If you only signed up for this week, you've not yet been added to that weekly email list, because we don't like to send emails to people unless they want them to come to them. And just so that you know, I'm the only one with that list. No one else even has the list to see it. And when I send it out to everyone, I put everybody in a BCC category. So your email address does not even show to other participants that we send the emails out to, because I believe in protecting them. So with that said, we'll get on with tonight's meeting. And tonight we're going to talk about 2 public comments that we recently put in, and they were both for scoping documents. And that's wholly different than putting in a public comment on an EA. An EA is an environmental assessment. When an environmental assessment comes out, the public comments are much more in depth, because you're refuting things like laws that they say that that plan is in compliance with, and different studies and things like that. So you're refuting the legal aspect, the scientific information that they present. And then usually we go into a section on the numbers, and we look at their census and what they claim the numbers are. And we look at the AUMs, and we'll go into some of the acronyms during this meeting. But for a scoping document, basically what you're telling them is what you want turned in. So we're going to compare our outlines for both the Clan Alpine HMA, and that one was to create an EA. They're just saying we're going to do one. And again, an EA is an environmental assessment, and that usually means it's planned to gather animals down to the low end population number, which is an AML, and also to apply fertility control. So the EA that they plan to do for the Clan Alpine HMA would be to initially remove approximately 1,124 horses. It'll be more when the actual EA comes out, because they'll have had babies this year. So, and the census that they did was from last year. So they'll add this year's what they call foal crop, or babies. And then they plan to keep the herd within the AML range of 612 to 979 for the 10-year time, and apply fertility control during the 10-year time. Some of the issues with that would be obviously that we don't know what the fertility control would be. So in this case, they claim it's going to be Gonacon. And again, that would be done over a 10-year period of time, keeping them at the low end AML. Anytime they get over the high end AML, they'll gather them. For McCullough Peaks HMA, that plan was to create an EA to initially remove approximately 39 horses and keep the population at 140 is what they say. However, the AML is 70 to 140, and then they would apply fertility control over the next 10 years. That herd's already been getting PZP'd. And so they would continue that for 10 years with one exception, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So we have two plans. One's to remove over 1,100 horses, and the other one 39 horses. So our focus has primarily been on Clan Alpine, since it's a huge gather, a large number of horses that are being removed. Not that we don't care about 39 horses in McCullough Peaks. We do. We did comment. We have some issues with that plan, but our focus is on this bigger gather where we're going to lose a lot of our horses. So I already kind of briefly explained what a scoping public comment is. That's what you expect to see in their EA or an EIS, either one. But in this case, they're both EAs. An EIS is an environmental impact statement. We'll get into that in a bit as well. So some of the things that we always say we want are a whole list of documents. You'll see that in the slides. There's census reports, which is the way they tell us how many horses are out there. And of course, those are estimated too. So we'll get into that in a bit. The utilization reports, which is how they determine who's eating what forage out there. And then genetic reports for the herds. And of course, the AUMs, and AUMs we'll explain in detail in a little bit as well. Those are animal unit months. It's the way they allocate forage. So moving on, the Clan Alpine HMA, BLM announced plans to do an EA. The first thing we said right off the bat was, EIS, this should be a environmental impact statement. BLM has mandates from President Biden. There's two different executive orders that says that they have to consider climate crisis in all final agency decisions. And an environmental assessment, when they put out their final decision on it after, okay, they do scoping, we put in public comments. They come out with their EA, they won't do an EIS, they're not going to listen to us, they never do, but we always include it. So when they come out with their EA, there's another public comment period. And then after they consider the public comments and make whatever changes they're going to make, they will put out a final decision record. And that's called a final agency decision. So what President Biden has said in two different executive orders is that they have to consider the current climate crisis. They have to let us know, how does that fit into the current climate crisis? How is what you're doing going to make that situation better or not make it any worse? So the other thing that an EIS would include is a cost analysis of all the alternatives. So when they put out an EA, they'll give you a list of alternatives that you can choose from, and they'll say, this is our preferred alternative. And it's always to gather the horses and give them fertility control and blah, blah, blah. They'll include things like no action will be one alternative, which is the one we always choose because we don't agree with what they're doing. And then they'll give you one that's usually something like, we'll gather the horses, but not down to the low end HML, or we'll gather the horses, but not apply fertility control, things that you also know they're not going to do. So they usually give you three alternatives to choose from. And an EIS would take those plus the alternatives that they say they listed, but said that they aren't going to consider them any further. We looked at them, but we're not going to consider them any further. One is usually removing livestock instead of our wild horses. And what the EIS does is a cost analysis of all of those alternatives. And it's never done in an EA. Only an EIS does those cost analysis. They're mandated in the EIS. So that's the biggest reason that we ask for an EIS, is because we want them to have to do the cost analysis. We're taxpayers. We pay that money. They should be telling us what we're paying for. So NEPA directs federal agencies to thoroughly assess environmental consequences of major federal actions significantly affecting the environment. The catch there is the word significantly. What significantly affects the environment? Well, according to BLM, not much. According to us, a whole lot more. So BLM never includes the impact to humans or the horses. They'll do one on, the impact to the endangered species. And of course, there never is one. They'll do impact to water, the actual land itself, and they'll give you how they're going to protect, those areas or whatever. They're going to set up traps away from sensitive areas, like sage grouse leks is a big one. Leks are their breeding grounds for sage grouse, and they're critical but not listed in endangered species, but they also have to work around them, and they know it or they're going to get listed, and they don't want them to be listed. So they do all these, we set up our traps well away from that. We're going to keep the air flight well away from their areas, blah, blah, blah. So at any rate, those are the impacts they do consider. So what they don't consider is that environmental impact isn't solely on the rangelands, but it's on the horses too. What kind of an impact does their decision have on the horses? Wild free roaming horses contribute to the diversity of life forms. That's never included. They don't believe it. They say the opposite. Removal of a large number of horses affects the genetic health of the herd, as does their fertility control plans, and they don't put those impacts in there either. And then, when Congress passed the Wild Horse and Burro Act, they said that these horses were an integral part of the natural system of public lands. That's not included. And a removal of a substantial number of wild horses will affect the quality of the human environment, as that quality is viewed by Congress, right? The Congress said that people enjoy them and see them significantly as a part of our historic past. And so the question again becomes, what is significant? And that's what we always challenge when we do our public comments. So EIS is the first thing we ask for. Our Clan Alpine scoping public comment outline is number one was EIS. So, obviously I put the title one slide too late, but you get the point. The 10-year plan. All of these plans that they're doing the last couple of years have been 10-year plans. And it used to be any single action they had to do an EA for. Well, now they're doing these so that they don't have to do another one for 10 years. And it's kind of like they do for grazing permits. They've got to renew them every 10 years. So they figure, we'll just do the horses every 10 years. But what that opened them up to was a lawsuit. And that's this Friend of Animals lawsuit that's listed on the first sub bullet point. And what the court said about 10-year plans was that they agreed that BLM's 10-year deadline exceeds its discretion per statutory command to immediately remove excess animals from the range so as to achieve appropriate management levels. 10-year plans don't keep up with possible climate changes. It's back to the first sub bullet point where what the courts say, and it's a really weak ruling, but it is a ruling that says that they're exceeding their own authority under these statutory commands. And the statutory command that they're stating in here is to immediately remove excess animals from the range. Now, if you have a plan that says we're going to remove some now and we might remove some again in 9 years, that doesn't fit immediately. So the word in the law immediately is what stopped the 10-year plans in the courts. Okay, the other sub bullet points are our opinion of these 10-year plans. That they do not keep up with possible climate changes. There's a lot that can change in a 10-year period of time. Therefore, will it be necessary to leave more horses out there? There's so many changes. We could all of a sudden start getting floods in the West. Water won't be an issue anymore, but yet they're going to remove horses because the land is damaged anytime during the 10 years because they already got approval during an EA this year. So, it could be that we get more predators. If wolves are reintroduced to an area, they have more predators, they have more attrition, more deaths. And that might change how often they need to do gathers or the fertility control that they plan to apply. And we don't want them to have just a blanket authority to do what they want during these 10 years, not knowing what exactly the situation is on the ground. And there's too many changes that can happen too quickly to do that. 10-year plans also decrease the possibility for human involvement, including viewing the gathers, any releases that they have, but more importantly, the need for each gather done beyond the initial one, we won't know the reason for those gathers. And 10-year plans are always to remove horses whenever they're over the AML. AML is a number, and that number has been said by the National Academy of Sciences, by several different scientists themselves, that it's arbitrary. There's no scientific reason for the number to be what it is. And when that was challenged in court, the court said that AML in and of itself does not prove excess horses. They had the BLM was directed by that court decision to give a scientific reason for removing the horses. Was it land degradation? Was it unhealthy horses? You know, what was the actual reason that these horses were excess? Not a number. And so this 10-year plan, what they say is anytime they reach the high end of AML, they're going to gather them up and remove them. And that's not okay. That's not what the courts ordered them to do. So we have issues with the 10-year plan. Next would be AUMs, which I mentioned above, and that's animal unit months. An AUM is the amount of forage needed to sustain one cow and her calf, or cow-calf pair is something you'll hear, 5 sheep or goats. I don't know of any goats on public lands, but it's in the law. 1 horse or 5 burros for 1 month. So when BLM decides how many animals they can have in a specific area, they allot the forage using those AUMs. It's a formula that they come up with. So the AUMs are used to decide how many of each species can be on a given area. We ask that BLM always include the relevant document that shows how forage was allocated to each species. So in other words, how did you decide how many horses or burros get to be there? How many cows get to be there? How many goats? How many burros? You know, whatever the situation is, how did you decide this? That would also include any large wildlife that is an herbivore. So elk, deer, antelope, they all fit into that, but they're all lumped into a category that's called wildlife on the AUM forage allocations. So we always ask for that document because we want to know if the horses and burros are given principal use, equal use, or less than equal. It's rare that they even get equal. And you guys have probably all heard that BLM says that they have to manage for multiple uses. Therefore, horses don't get principal use unless it's on the range. And according to them, in their own interpretation of the laws, they say that the Secretary of the Interior gets to decide if an area is a range. And they only have 3 of them in the United States for horses and 1 for burros. And what we always assert, and I have a legal opinion that's written, if you guys want it, you can message us for the document, but it's called relabeling. And it's got a long title, but the first word I think is relabeling. So that's what I call it, the relabeling paper. But at any rate, we talk about how the mandate to manage lands for multiple uses was in FLPMA, the Federal Land Management Policy Act, Federal Land Policy Management Act. But what never happened was they never said that areas that were managed already for wild horses and burros were no longer going to be managed principally for wild horses and burros. They just said that those areas had to be managed for multiple uses. And it doesn't mean that every use like livestock gets to be on every area. It depends on whether or not the land can sustain them. So we still fight for the fact that those horses and burros are supposed to have principal use of those areas, which means they would get a principal allocation of the forage. So that's always built into our comments as well. And the utilization studies are another big part of that. The BLM started using utilization studies last year. We saw, I think, our first one, and that was with the situation with the PIM horses in Colorado. And it was actually a couple of water districts that hired a company, and BLM paid for it. to do a utilization study to determine which animals were eating the forage. And we always ask that they provide those studies. They determine that determine which species consumes how much forage. And we ask BLM to give us the specifics, like who did the study, what was their conflict of interest, and how the plot points are chosen, how many there are, what dates, times of year the study was done, whether or not livestock were on or were removed from the area, and the date that they were on or removed from the area, because those are all important things. We know that it can take up to 20 years for an area that's been heavily overgrazed by livestock to recover. So if they remove the cattle 3 months earlier, then they do a utilization study and it's all horses that are eating it. They could say, see, the land's destroyed and it was all horses. And you don't get the true picture because the cattle had just been removed 3 months prior. So those are some important things that we ask for. The reason for the plot points is because we work with scientists, and we know that those plot points have to be chosen randomly. Otherwise, it skews the study and automatically gives it a bias. So those are some of the things that we ask for. And then if we don't understand the data that we're given from that, we give it to one of our scientists and say, can you look at this study? Give us your review of this study. And that seems to work really well. And we've worked with people from Western watersheds on that and other places. Okay, so is everybody with me so far? Does anybody have questions? Am I just overwhelming everybody?
Yes, I'm overwhelmed.
Well, okay. Just so that you know, the slideshow is something I can send to you if you request it. We are also recording this. Once we figure out how to upload our recordings to a YouTube channel, all of these PIMs that we've done lately will be available on YouTube, like the Teddy Roosevelt National Park one that we did. I think we did 2 from that. But these things will all be available for you to be able to look at and watch the videos of. So if you're not following me, it's okay. Just do it again and do it again and do it again, and you'll get it. So if nobody has questions.
It's not that I don't follow you, but then after I hear another 20 minutes worth of information, it's like, you know, what was she talking about earlier?
Do we need to do things in shorter bites?
No,
okay.
No.
I think if we start putting them out there too with the slides, it'll help people. They can go back and read and go, oh yeah, I remember what she said. So if nobody has questions, we'll move on.
I have a quick question.
Okay.
Hi, this is Linda. Hi. I'd never heard really the term relabeling, but I always thought when I do comments, I always talk about the Wild Free Roaming Horses and Burros Act and the principal use of the land. But I always thought that the HAs are not principally for the horses anymore, because they've kind of moved, you know, the acreage that the wild horses had in 1971 is like half now what they had.
And that is the relabeling portion of that paper.
Okay, so
the second part of it goes into flip-on principal use. So yeah, they're both issues are in there. Okay. And I do talk a lot about how they went from just being the range to then developing HAs, then smaller HMAs, then complexes. And so I got into the whole issue in the paper. So if you don't have it, shoot me an email or leave us a message.
Okay.
And I'll make sure I get you the paper. It's a 28-page paper, but it's packed full of information. And I used all of BLM's own words against them.
Oh, good.
So well, you'll enjoy that.
I just want to make sure that when I'm commenting that I'm getting it right by saying the way I understood it is the HMAs are still they're principally for the horses. The HMAs are supposed to be principally for the horses currently. Is that true?
Yes.
Okay.
And they should be using the original HAs that were bigger areas.
Right. They should.
When FLPMA came about, they went, oh, we get to manage this area for multiple uses. So we're going to put the horses over here in this corner of the HA, and we're going to call that the HMA. and that's what we're gonna manage for the horses.
But at the
And
very
then they
least,
still put cattle on that.
right, but at the very least, they should give us the HMAs, and they're not even doing that. They're putting cattle on those too.
That's right.
Which
That's
is
right.
ridiculous.
Cattle are everywhere. So
know.
yeah,
Okay.
you'll see in the paper, I list the acreages and what they lost and when they lost. And
Yeah,
uh, so we refute a lot in that paper, and I think it'll be useful for your public comments too.
Okay.
So
thanks.
I'd be glad to share it with you. Anybody else before we move on?
I have a quick question that goes back to quite some time before. At
Okay.
one point, you said how many HMOs were no longer. That at one time there was, the number was higher than it is now.
Right.
Do so how many HMAs have we actually lost? And is
Oh,
that
gosh.
part of the, is it 200,000 acres that was taken away?
Don't test my knowledge of numbers tonight. I'd have to pull it all up to see, but I think there were, no, I'm not even gonna guess because I'd be off. I would have to pull it up in the paper, but it's all in that relabeling paper, TJ. How many
Okay.
HAs there were in the first place, and then how many HMAs and how they've been degraded and decreased, and how much land was lost. But yeah, we lost almost half the land in the relabeling of HA to HMA, and then zeroing out a lot of the HMAs as well. And then after that, we found out that they still include acreage in that total number that they say they manage. And also with the use of cattle on these smaller HMAs, in our figures, we found out that they're on approximately 12% of the acreage that they originally had after the 1971 Act. So it's really pathetic how much acreage they actually have to use right now. So, but it's all in the paper. You'd have to go through it again or pick my brain when I can look it up for you. So my
Okay,
brain's
thank you.
not
Thank
what it
you.
was. I don't remember all the numbers anymore. So
I just couldn't remember where it was. Thank you.
you're welcome, ma'am. Okay, so we'll move on.
Yes.
Okay, grazing history. So in the case of Clan Alpine, we found some inconsistencies between documents that we dug up, even though the only document you were commenting on is a scoping document. What we do right off the bat is we pull up the resource management plan, which is usually the overall plan for that, for a big area that will include the small HMA, but it'll have things like the extractive industry, any mining, oil or gas. It'll have the grazing information. It'll have any endangered species information, recreation information will be on there. Everything that's done in this big area will be built into an RMP, and they're usually about 450-ish pages of documents, and it's put together in the big resource management plan for that area. So we'll go through that, and then we'll pull out old EAs that they've done for the HMA if you can find them online, the herd management plans if you can find, or HMAPs if you can find them. So we go through a lot of research to find all the documents we can find as soon as we get these scoping comments. And when we found some of these inconsistencies in the grazing information, we found that some said that the cattle had been removed, others said that they hadn't been removed, and others said that there were trespass cattle that were supposed to be gone that were still there. So we asked for 50 years of grazing history, and that they include reports that documented unauthorized livestock or cattle in this case. We also asked for maps, and if you guys have looked at many BLM documents, you know that their maps are terrible. So we asked them to provide maps that showed the HMA, the cattle allotments, any water on the HMA, fences and gates. Ask them to include when the gates are opened and closed in the map key. BLM very often employs something that they call cattle gone, water off. And what that means is that when the cattle are gone, the livestock producers no longer provide water to the area. And if there's still water in water holes, a lot of times they leave the gates closed so the horses can't get to them. And it's been a real good way for them to say there's no water, it's a drought, it's emergency gather, we're taking them off the land. We have also found where somebody left a gate closed with horses in the pasture and the water was gone. The horses tried to get out and all they had was a cattle guard. The family, the stallion tried to cross the cattle guard and broke both legs and died there. And the rest of his family died along the fence line right behind him. And that was a situation where they had been notified before they had dead horses that that was the situation. And they said they would go out and open the gate. They never did it. And the horses died. So it's a strategy that they very often employ to either kill off horses or to provide an excuse to go gather them. So we're asking now that we want all this information ahead of time. And it's a good way to be able to protect the herd. Genetic reports. Obviously, you know, if they plan on using any kind of fertility control, we want to see that the genetic reports are done. We want them to do it before the horses are permanently removed. Now, if you're saying the horse is excess, therefore it's going to be permanently removed from the herd, well, we want you to prove to us that it's excess genetically. That horse is not needed for the genetic health of the herd. So, and BLM likes to do the removals and then genetically test the horses they're going to put back out there. That makes no sense. You need to test them all and decide who can genetically be removed from the herd. So we're asking ahead of time for that genetic testing to see when the last one was done and what it said. And again, we have scientists that can read those if we don't understand them. Census reports, BLM should include all the census reports. This would be how they gather their population information. So most of the time it's flight. Sometimes it's on ground population gathering. Most of the time it's compiled during an aerial survey. We want BLM to provide the pilot reports along with their summary of the data that's compiled. The reason we ask for both is because in one case in 2016 or 18, they did a gather here in Oregon and they had popped up the pilot's report online and I happened to see it and read it. And next thing I knew, they took it down and they put up their own summary and it was different. It had different facts. At the time, I hadn't thought to screenshot it. So I didn't have proof, but I certainly did make an affidavit saying this is what I saw and this is what's now up there and they're different statistics. Why? So from then on, we've always asked for the actual pilot report along with the BLM summary. So we're just calling into fact that they're not always the most honest people in the world. They also need to include photos taken during their census gathering. And we recently, during a case that we're involved in right now for the Bordeaux Atravesado horses in New Mexico, we questioned the aerial survey and whether or not it happened when they said it did, and whether or not horses were off the HMA where they said they were, because we had on the ground people there that definitely saw something different. So we asked for the photos and they didn't provide them. And so we actually found technical, what are they called? Technical reports, technical instructions. I can't remember what they're called. It's a technical something or other that stated that they have to provide photos as part of their data that proves, you know, this is where we saw horses. These are the horses we saw here and here and here. So they have to provide that when they put out their census data. So that's part of our court case now that we're fighting. So we'll see what the court rules, but we're saying they've got to provide that information. So we're asking for it right off the bat in these comments for scoping, so they know we're not going to just accept your word that you allegedly saw this many horses. We want the pictures. And that'll show us also what the land really looks like. So it'll be a twofold benefit. Environmental assessments, or EAs. BLM should always provide all relevant documents for the HMA. This would include any EAs that they've done for the HMA in the past, and the grazing allotments, any EAs that were done for grazing allotments, or sometimes they're called rangeland health assessments. And those are done in lieu of a full-blown EA. A lot of times when they renew a grazing permit, they do those grazing allotment in a rangeland health assessment. And those have been very telling for us, because in another case that we're pursuing for Bible Springs Complex in Utah, the land health assessments said the opposite of what they were claiming the rangeland looked like out there. So in one document to renew a grazing permit, they said that the rangeland met all standards, meaning that it looked great. They were doing good, plenty of forage, lots of water, doing great. When they wanted to remove the horses there, they said, oh, the rangeland's in terrible condition. There's no forage out there. There's no water out there. So we're proving that they contradicted themselves based on what decision they wanted to make. So we're asking, we want the rangeland health assessments. So again, we're putting them on notice. We know you're not truthful. We know you're not honest. So provide us this information and show us that if the rangeland is so bad, you also denied the grazing permit. Okay, so environmental impact statements we touched on above. We want any environmental impact statements that were done for the HMA. If there's, you're not going to find it for the horses. I put that on here. The only EIS we ever found for horses, I think, was done for the Prior Mountain horses in Montana. But we've never found one historically or not for any other wild horse area. Livestock, sometimes you find one if there's something major going on with the livestock that are going to be there sometimes, but that's rare as well. Extractive industries, always. There's always an EIS. So for then, that's again is mining, oil and gas. You'll always find them. So we're asking for that HMA, anything that's done in that area, we want to see any EIS. Other things, complaints or previous or current, and trap sites. BLM should include all complaints about horses or livestock, unauthorized or authorized by anyone. So if they're claiming that the permittees, bitching that the horses are on his private land, which is the case with the Bordeaux Atravesado in New Mexico, they claimed that, well, he did. The rancher that was there complained that the horses were off the HMA and were on his private property. And so we want to see those complaints. Part of the reason for that is you want to see how close those complaints come in to when they decide to put out the EA. In Bordeaux, one of the things we saw was them they built a lie. The grazing permit was up for renewal. The land looked terrible. So the guy blamed it on the horses and said, oh, well, there's horses here. Here's my complaint for it. And then his buddy, who's the pilot who did the survey, said, oh yeah, I flew a flight back in March, and these horses are so, overbooked and they're off the HMA. And, he just happened to not have enough fuel to cover the whole HMA, but actually covered land off the HMA where the livestock permittee said months later that the horses were there. And he just happened to do it months earlier, finding the horses in that same area, but yet not covering a third of the HMA because he supposedly ran out of fuel and time. And his family's been in this business doing these aerial surveys for 30 years. They know how much fuel and time they need to do that area. So we didn't buy it. And when we dug into it more, we found financial records that he got paid a month after the complaint came in from the permittee. Federal contractors have to be paid within 30 days of their service. So there was no way he had done it way back in March. He had done it when they were planning to build a situation that made it look like they had to remove the horses. So it's another reason that you ask for all of this stuff, because you want to be able to put that stuff together and say, court, you know, judge, this is what we think happened. And if you look at this evidence, we think it proves our theory of what happened here and not what BLM is presenting. So it's important to ask for. And again, traps are also another thing to ask for. And part of the reason is that they've got traps that are actually near the HMA, but off of it. And then you have to look at where the complaints came from. Did the guy have a trap set up so that he was actually luring the wild horses off the public lands and onto his private land? If there's a trap set up there, that's probably the case. And it is illegal for people to lure horses off of public lands onto private property. The BLM can set up a trap there, an individual cannot. And that's what's going on with Pine Nut right now, is that they've got individuals setting those up. That is a federal offense. I keep telling the people who saw it, who took pictures. We've dealt with Mary Siafi in the past when this happened, and we actually got a guy fired from his position on the town, I don't know, his town council or some board or something. He was a local politician. We actually got him, he had to resign. They didn't fire him, but they asked him to resign, and he did, because he was setting up traps on his private land to lure the pine nut horses, and then called BLM to have them remove them. Same thing's happening this time. I don't know why they're not reporting it. And now all of a sudden Pine Nuts has put up a statement on their e-planning site that says that they're doing emergency removals for public safety because the horses are off the HMA. So lure them off, they're going to come off. They know that's where the food is. So it's important to know where the traps are as well if they claim that the horses are off the HMA. Next would be references. And this is a big one for us. And I think this is one that may win a case or two for us, is reference material. The BLM, when they're writing an EA, refers to other documents or studies that they use to support their narrative, right? So they refer to the Resource Management Plan, RMP, or they'll refer to, you know, a Turner study that they use him plenty, but they refer to all these different studies saying that, you know, this product is safe, or horses chase other wildlife away, and they'll give you the name of the study and they'll put it in their list of literature cited. Well, when they do that, their handbook, which is H 1790, it's their NEPA handbook. It says that any reference that they cite must be reasonably accessible to the public. And they're very often not reasonably accessible. When you look them up online, sometimes you'll find that they're on a site that is a paywall. You can see the abstract, but to read the whole document, you've got to pay either for the document or you've got to be a member of their site, which is often a paid thing as well. That's not reasonably accessible. Now, we always ask for these documents to be included with the EA, whether they upload them or have them on a different website or whatever. We ask for things like the original map of the HA instead of just the HMA. We want the original map, and those are really hard to find. We want the herd management plan or herd management area plan, HMAP. In the last case, they literally had an HMAP that was a map of the HMA. It wasn't a management plan. They called their herd management plan an HMP, or herd management plan. So they call them various things too, which makes it hard to know what you're asking for. So we just asked for both. The original document that determined the AML, how was that appropriate management level achieved? And when was it achieved? When was it renewed or reviewed? When have they updated it for all the climate change that's gone on, for the use of livestock that may have changed, for other grazers that may have been there in the first place and are gone now. So we asked for the original AML documentation. Any rangeland health assessments, we already went over that. A lot of times that's for the allotments. All scientific reports, studies, papers, articles, etc. Those are the ones where they would say, horses drive other wildlife away from water holes, and then they'll cite a person's name in the year. We want those studies because a lot of times BLM takes things out of context. They'll use part of a sentence, but not the entire sentence, and the rest of it might change the whole context of what they quoted. So we go through those studies. Now, BLM's recent thoughts on the definition of reasonably accessible have been interesting. They think it's okay if it's behind a paywall and it's only an abstract. You only have to read the abstract, right? And then the other thing they told us is that we can drive to the field office and view it in their public reading room. If a document like the RMP is only available at the field office, that's a document I already said can be like 450 pages long. I don't think I'm going to want to sit in a BLM reading office to try to read a 450 page document. I'm going to want to take it home and sit down and read it, highlight it, mark it up, and ask my questions about it. Look at how the EA isn't in compliance with it, which we very often find. A lot of the RMPs are simply not online because they're old and they are before internet times. So they're not online and they don't want to have to scan them and put them online. So that's an issue that we come across with them, and we're just not accepting it. The other excuse we've gotten is that there's license and copyright issues with a lot of the studies that they use. And we're like, then you can't use them because your handbook says that they have to be reasonably accessible to the public. So when we do our comments on an EA, we will then go through the references that they cite and list all the ones that are not available to us. So we're telling them ahead of time here, if you list your references, they better be available to us. Okay. Climate crisis. We talked about this a little bit before, but in this specific case, and again, this is the Clan Alpine HMA, we specifically said that they should consider updating the CRMP. They call it the Consolidated Resource Management Plan, because each section, like the one on recreation, the one on livestock, the one on mining, they were all written separately. And then it was put together into a consolidated resource management plan. So that's why they call that the CRMP. Again, have fun trying to figure out what BLM calls certain documents because they call them all different names. And that makes it harder for you to request them because they'll say, we don't have an RMP. You have a CRMP. So they know what you mean, but they'll say, we don't have one in place, stupid. Here's the two executive orders we talked about that were submitted for all agencies. The first one is EO 13990 or Executive Order 13990, Protecting Public Health and Environment, Restoring Science to Tackle the Climate Crisis. Highlights the need to use science to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, bolster resilience to the impacts of climate change, and prioritize environmental justice. The greenhouse gas is the big one because obviously cows. Cattle contribute over 55% of methane emissions in this country. So that's a huge one. And horses don't. They're hindgut fermenters. So different digestive system. If you want to get into that, that's a whole nother PIM. Executive Order 14008, tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, calls for quick action to build resilience against the impacts of climate change, bolster adaptation, and increase resilience across all operations, programs, assets, and mission responsibilities, with a focus on the most pressing climate vulnerabilities. Again, greenhouse gases would fit into that. Removing wild horses from the ecosystem does not tackle climate crisis at all. It may in fact harm it further. However, reducing livestock, which BLM always claims is outside the scope of all wild horse or NEPA projects would significantly reduce the impact of methane emissions and loss of carbon sequestration. And again, if we want to get into climate stuff, we can have another PIM on that. In fact, there's a wonderful scientist that I would love to bring on, so we might do that at some point. Therefore, BLM should, if not considering other large herbivores on the same HMA as these horses are in, the same management plan, where you intend to remove a significant portion of the wild horses. If they claim that this is outside the scope of a specific EA, then they should first step back and review their 22-year-old CRMP. So what we're saying here is, hey, you know, if you're going to say it's outside the scope to consider the climate crisis in all species that are out there, then you need to first step back and update your CRMP before you attempt to do this. So we're giving them fair warning. Next is fertility control. We would state here that we adamantly oppose the use of Gonacon, which is the plan for this clan Alpine herd. With the current research that's been provided to the public, there's no conclusion or final study that's been published for the Theodore Roosevelt National Park wild horse herd where they did a Gonacon experiment. The EPA has not answered a FOIA request, which is a request for public records. It's the Freedom of Information Act is FOIA. They have not answered that FOIA request for studies that we submitted in order to get, that were submitted, not that we submitted, that were submitted in order to get Gonacon registered for use in equines. We know that those studies that were submitted were done by APHIS or USDA, so, you know, the livestock industry. And I just found today a bunch of information that I posted online about that. There's one on my personal timeline that was published by APHIS, and it talks about how they were able to get waivers for most of the studies that were done to get that approved. And it was because they said things like it was unlikely that a human would have, you know, effects from it, or that it was low risk that humans would be, you know, affected by it. But the other question we have is the feed through properties of a predator or a carrion consumer that might consume the flesh of an animal that died out there that had been treated with it. And could that be sterilizing people? So the EPA has not yet given us those studies. And in fact, we had a whistleblower letter that came in that told us, you better ask them why they're sitting on these studies. So we're even more concerned now than we were. That request is almost a year old. They're supposed to answer it within 20 days. It's still not been done. So we're saying that information's got to be provided before BLM can legally use Gonacon. We know they're using it. We believe the use of it is illegal because it was still considered experimental. And those research studies, the final report has still not been put out. And if you missed our PIM a couple of weeks ago, what I specifically said, and Teddy Roosevelt, was I believe they want to get rid of those horses to cover up the fact that they've all been sterilized by Gonacon. I think they don't want the public to know the true results, because then the public would really rally against BLM using it. So along with Gonacon, we would oppose plans that include any kind of sterilization. Mere sterilization plans are highly invasive, dangerous. Gelding stallions or returning them to the wild takes the place of horses that are fertile and can contribute to the overall genetic viability of our wild horses. We oppose the IUDs because of health risks and pain that might occur for mares that are released and not continuously monitored like a tame horse in someone's pasture or barn. So we have a lot of issues with the fertility control plans that are out there right now. IUDs is another big one because there's a new design that they claim works better. So those are things that we are opposed to, and we'll fight them on. Next is kind of a fun one. We said we hope BLM doesn't use a template or a boilerplate to develop this NEPA document. The requirements put on BLM for EIS and EA NEPA documents mandate that they do a site-specific analysis. We found during our workshops, when doing an EA, BLM sometimes forgets to change the file name. So it may say template or forget to change the name of an HMA on the file name. This was this little picture down below here. It was during an EA that we were doing for Roberts Mountain Complex. And we happened to notice the title of the file there, Pancake Complex. Oops, they forgot to change the title. And here's another one from that same one. Specifically says it's an EA template. So instead of doing a site-specific analysis, they have a template, they open it up, and they punch in what's different for that specific HMA into the blanks that they're supposed to fill in for the HMA they're doing the template for. The Bordeaux Travestado case in New Mexico again, we found a word that they should have replaced and they forgot to do it. So we brought that up and said, look, it's obvious they're using a template. In the Bordeaux case, the other thing was on the references. There were 30 references that were in their literature cited list that weren't even used in the EA. So I brought that to their attention in our public comments, and they removed those 30 from the literature cited list. But it was obvious that they're using a cut and paste list for references as well. So they're not doing their homework very well. And we're catching that and picking it up and saying, hey, you can't do this. So, okay, that was it for Clan Alpine. Did anybody have questions on that before we move on to McCullough Peaks? No? Okay.
Yeah, can I point out also on the gelding, they had planned on gelding and returning stallions also on Clan Alpine.
Returning the geldings, you mean?
Yeah,
Yeah, which, yeah, we said it takes the place of another horse that could be fertile and needed for genetic variability.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have an issue that they shouldn't be counted if they're sterile and they're put back out there. They shouldn't be counted in the total AML. They have to be, because there is a limited amount of forage and water right now. With the droughts out there, there really is a limited amount in most of the HMAs. And if you've got a limited amount of forage, you really do need to know how many animals are out there eating the forage. So it's not a number that's just based on reproduction. It's also based on consumption. What do they consume out there? So it is important that they know how many animals are consuming forage. So they do have to count them. And of course, the AML is based on the forage allocations in the first place. So they're not going to stop doing that. But it is a thought, I think. I don't think that geldings should be put back out there, because they also have different behaviors. If they were part of a large band, you called them and put them back out there, they're never going to be accepted back into the band. They're not stallions anymore. They have different behaviors. They have different smells for that matter. They're not going to be accepted. So you're going to force them into lives in bachelor bands, and that's going to increase fighting. So it's not a good situation for them or for the herd either. So I don't think they should be putting geldings back out there. So, okay. Anyway, we'll move on to McCullough Peaks. Again, their plan is to do an EA, not an EIS, which of course we asked for it again and we talked about above. And the human environment is particularly important for McCullough Peaks, because it's what we call a Hollywood herd. There's a lot of photographers and people that go specifically to see that herd. So the human environment is something that they have to take into account. And we don't see that they're going to do that. We again pointed out that the 10-year plans aren't legal, and that this again is a 10-year plan. And even though it's different, because they're not planning on decimating the entire herd, they're planning on taking 39 of the horses. So you still want to say, look, that's fine, but you're not doing a 10-year plan. We asked for clarification on how many horses would be removed. The scoping announcement, if you've read that, the letter, says that they're going to remove them to the low end AML, which would be 70 horses. I have talked to Abel Guevara a few times. I talked to him on the phone, talked to him in email a few times, and he said he wanted to clarify that they are only going to remove to the high end AML, or approximately 39 horses. So we asked for clarification on that, because the request for an EIS would be bolstered even more if they're going to remove them to 70 horses, which would be 61% of the herd, versus the smaller number of 39, which would be roughly 22% of the herd. I also have talked to him and warned him that, you know, while I support the great work they've done with PZP, you know, we would like to know, or would like him to know, that we are adamantly opposed to using GonaCon. And I talked to you about that above, but we feel that even though BLM or Abel himself said that they want to use it on 2 or 3 older mares, GonaCon that is, who didn't respond to PZP, we don't trust that once the doors open to using it on just one horse in the herd, they won't decide within that 10-year period of time that, hey, it worked for a difficult horse, so it'll work for all of them. We're just going to use it on all of them. And as I told you guys, I have serious concerns about GonaCon. I believe it's just sterilizing the horses. Maybe not after 1 injection, but after 2, I think there's a really high rate of animals not returning to fertility. And I've been reading about GonaCon on kangaroos, on elephants, on dogs, on cats, feral cats in one place, on wild horses, obviously, cows in India, using GonaCon on cows. And the every one of the reports, the one thing that's very common is that after a booster, that second vaccine, they don't know how long it takes the animal to return to fertility, if they will. Kangaroos, it's as long as 8 years before they come back to fertility after a booster shot. 8 years is a long time in the life of a reproducing mare. So we have real big concerns with that. So at any rate, you know, we gave them a heads up that we're adamantly opposed to it for even one horse. We asked that BLM include specific data on PZB darting in the HMA. How many mares were darted yearly? How many horses were born yearly? How many survived? The data on how many mares returned to fertility after darting. How many mares had foals that survived yearly. An explanation of why the birth and nutrition rates aren't equal. The goal of PZP or any fertility control is to have the horses at AML and then have the fertility reduced so that your births meet your attrition rates. And attrition is your death, right? The deaths that happen, the attrition rate. So if the births that you have meet the attrition number, then ideally your population is going to stay the same. And if that hasn't happened in this case, and they've been employing PZP all these years, why hasn't it happened? Is it just the 2 or 3 older mares? Is there something else going on? So we want an explanation, because what BLM frequently does with PZP is set it up to fail. Why do they do that? Because PZP doesn't sterilize, and they want to switch to GonaCon that does. So we have big issues with GonaCon. The other issue I have with GonaCon is that it's hormonal. It changes the behavior of the horses. PZP doesn't do that. So we do have an issue with GonaCon that's huge. So other documents we asked to be included in the EA are all references mentioned in the EA or EIS. We talked about that above. All genetic reports throughout time for this herd. Again, I think that's important to look at, because people are concerned that use of PZP destroys the genetic health of the herd, and we want to see it. We don't believe that it does. The reports that we've seen from Assateague and other places it's used with other wildlife, it's never been an issue. So having that in front of us would be a good thing to be able to put out to the public to say, look, you know, we think this is our best option for population control unless we can get them to reintroduce predators. And I don't see that happening in my lifetime, even though that would be nice. So at any rate, all genetic reports, more detailed maps, we talked about that show landmarks, roads, livestock allotments, fencing boundaries, water sources, etc. The maps provided don't even have a map key for McCullough Peaks.
Oh, the
So,
maps in McCullough Peaks are horrible.
yeah, it was a joke. And
Yeah.
again, that was just a scoping document. So maybe they intended to put better maps on the EA, but we're letting them know ahead of time. This was wholly inadequate. They had different colored areas. It doesn't say what the areas are. If you've been looking at BLM maps for a long time, you can pretty much guess what those areas are. But again, it should be in the map key and it's not even there. So we're asking for better maps. We want the most current census gathering reports, including photos and the one previous to it. The reason we add the one previous to it is because we like to look at the estimates. Again, going back to the Bordeaux case that we're involved in, the when they do a census, they allow for a certain percentage of horses that they may have missed. You know, if they were behind a rock, under a tree, whatever, you know, they may have missed them in the count. So there's a certain percentage that the National Academy of Sciences said is average, and they always increase it by about that much. Well, in the one we found from previous years at Bordeaux, they said they estimated the error was only 3%, which is really low. But the one they did this year, it was 46% error. They admitted they had a bad flight and they should probably do it again. But they had a 46% error. So they estimated those horses were 46% over what they actually saw. They provided no evidence at all, no photos, no map of where they allegedly saw horses other than a hand-drawn thing that says, look, they were out of the HMA down here on this guy's private property. So we want the current census and the one before it. And then an age demographic of the entire herd, because one of the concerns we heard about, was it about McCullough Peaks, you guys, that the horses are getting very old? So there was a concern about replacing the horses that die off as they get older and
Yeah.
leaving more foals out there because they were removing foals.
Yeah, it was about, there's a lot of older horses there. A
Okay.
pretty percentage.
Okay, so we asked for age demographic. I think that's an issue with Teddy Roosevelt as well.
Yeah.
That's the one I remember more, is they're removing the younger foals and are very concerned about, you know, the older horses aging out of the herd and not having replacements there for them. So we asked for the age demographic just so we can see. Okay, other data or to include or information to provide would be research that shows when older mares start a decrease in pregnancy, meaning not getting pregnant annually. How is BLM proposed plan going to address the overall genetic health of the herd as many of these mares begin to age out of the breeding population? So there's what we just talked about. We want to see an alternative included that will retire the grazing permits and return the entire HA, not just the HMA, to principal use by wild horses. And we talked about that a little bit earlier. We asked that BLM, or we stated BLM often uses research studies or reports that are obviously biased. BLM is required by law to use the best available science. And if you've read a lot of their studies and reports that they use, a lot of times right in the title, it'll say feral horses instead of wild horses. So you can tell that the studies are just obviously biased by the language that they use. And we don't feel BLM should be using those because they are obviously biased. So we asked them to consider the studies and reports that they're using and what biases are there right off the bat. We'd like BLM to acknowledge the horses as native, and we put that in this document. At a minimum, they would be a reintroduced native species. We want them to do that instead of the usual rhetoric that these horses are descended from domestic ranch horses or cavalry, etc., that they are native animals. Words matter, and our determination of bias and political reasons for wild horse actions as opposed to management for the health of the herd. So we're not going to believe that you have the best intentions when you're using words that show us that you believe these are feral horses, that they're non-native horses, that they came from other places, that they don't belong there. We're not going to believe you have the best interest of the herd in mind. So that's our reason for telling them, we want you to change your language. We want you to consider the studies that you're putting out here and show us that you're not presenting a bias right off the bat. And then again, we brought up climate crisis, that they need to explain how the decision to reduce horses who are important to the ecosystem and healthy for the environment will provide a positive impact in relation to their mandate to consider the current climate crisis. And we talked about the EOs for that above. They help to mitigate wildfires, do not emit methane on the level cattle do, and are not responsible for the level of carbon release that cattle are. They don't hang out in riparian areas or in water sources like cattle do. So if reductions are necessary, please explain why this would be the time to do scoping to reevaluate. And oh boy, I worded that wrong. Why this would be the time to do scoping instead of to reevaluate the AUM allocations done in the RFP. We assume and or reevaluate the wild horse AML and livestock permitted numbers. That's a really bad sentence, you guys. So in other words, what we're saying is if it's really necessary, we want you to explain why this wouldn't be the time to do the scoping, reevaluate those AUMs, and reevaluate wild horse AML. And all of that's to take into account climate change. So that was the end of our comments for McCullough Peaks. And again, we want you to keep in mind that when you look at the overall picture and you see all the posts that are going out that social media blows up with, is not to get distracted by the shiniest object. And in this case, my fear is that the shiniest object is McCullough Peaks, where those horses have been managed pretty darn well for a lot of years and not had all the removals that others have. At the same time, you've got BLM putting out a plan for Clan Alpine to get rid of over 1,100 horses. That's the shiny object we should all be focused on. We should be screaming from the rooftops, wait a damn minute. You got all kinds of cattle over this thing. You said in the rangeland health assessments that the land was fine, the forage was fine, there's plenty of water, blah, blah, blah. But you're going to get rid of these horses. And that's a lot of horses. So focus on them both, but please put your bigger focus on the Clan Alpine stuff, because that's a lot of equines that we're going to be missing from the genetic pool. So that's it for me. Does anybody else have questions or comments?
No,
Nobody?
it's pretty stark, isn't it?
It is. It is. And it's
Yeah.
it's kind of a it's more than a sad situation. I think there's a rush right now to get these 10-year plans in, because I think they're going to know that they're going to be stopped by the courts.
Yeah.
And so I think they're rushing to get rid of horses as fast as they can. And once they have the 10-year plans in place, they hope that the court's not going to make their decisions retroactive. And so I think they're hoping they're going to get away with this. But you know, we'll file the complaints or the lawsuits as many as we can. Time is also a major issue for us in doing the lawsuits. Obviously, we have you know, concerns over the costs and stuff like that too, to be able to file them. And being a new organization on the block, we have contacts with all the old organizations that I've worked with over the years, but OWHO doesn't have the funding that those organizations do. So for us to be able to keep working, please, look at what we're doing for fundraisers. If there's something that kind of strikes your fancy and you can do a few bucks, please consider it. We're going to start up our auctions again. We've got some cool books that are elementary through high school aged that are all horse related for the wild horses. And there's a few other little products. There's a security camera and a heart rate watch thing. And so we lots of little goofy things. We've got our t-shirts and sweatshirts and tote bags and coffee cups. And so there's lots of things you can do to help us. We're taking this on the road. We're going to the Public Information Environmental Law Conference the beginning of March. And we'll be tabling at the conference and handing out our materials there. Costs us a little penny to do that. So, we don't like to sit and say donation, but unfortunately we need them once in a while. So if you can do it, we'd appreciate it. And
Val,
again, the meeting's
there
been
is a-
recorded. Yes.
There is one question from Holly or Hollis.
Oh, yes. Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, I'm in pretty regular contact with a lot of the people in the Virginia Range area, and they do a lot of PCP darting. It sounds like out of all the options, that would be the option you're most in favor of.
Yeah, okay, if you look at the big picture, we don't have the predators we used to have that controlled
Right,
all of our populations, right, including deer and elk and everything else. And
right.
so at some point there has to be some method of population control. There was a theory that went out saying that horses will self-regulate if there's not enough forage or water. That was
No.
proven wrong. That
Yeah.
was proven absolutely wrong. We know that they'll overpopulate an area. We do adamantly believe that they need to be given back their areas. And, that should be the bigger HA, not these little HMAs. They should be given priority use of those areas. And the AML should be increased to genetically viable herds, which they're not. And those are things that we fight for, while we also say we recognize that you're going to have some method of population control.
Okay,
And
so
at this point, go ahead,
Yes.
I'm sorry.
So that's okay. I'm sorry. The other question I posted, has anybody ever contacted the Office of the Inspector General to do an independent oversight assessment
Well,
of
the
BLMs?
Office of the Inspector General, we have filed several complaints with them, in fact.
Okay,
But the Office of the Inspector General is set up so that each agency has its own Office of the Inspector General in it. Okay.
huh,
And so when we looked into the OIG for BLM, it was someone appointed, or some people appointed by the Department of Interior.
oh, this sounds like nepotism. Okay,
Right. And that's the issue we were starting to come across. When we file our lawsuits, we file them with the Interior Board for Land Appeals.
yeah,
And it's a panel of judges. And we were having really good success with them. And all of a sudden it started to kind of turn where they were doing things that were a little biased in BLM's favor. So I said, okay, wait a minute, who appoints the judges? Well, yeah, they're appointed by the Department of Interior. So again, they're kind of self-policing. But I can tell you, we the two court cases we have that we're battling over right now, the court rulings have gone in our favor, just not for the entire case, but for things like the Bordeaux case. They're basically